When Microsoft launched the original Xbox in 2001, it had a lot of catching up to do. Microsoft was new to the game console market, despite being leaders in the personal computer market. PCs were considered to be the leaders of many genres, like real-time strategy games such as StarCraft, and first-person shooters like Doom and Quake, the latter of which Microsoft revolutionized on consoles with the launch of Halo. The Xbox's main competition were two titans of the gaming industry up to this point. The old guard, headed by Nintendo, whose name recognition alone made them a force to reckon with, despite their recently underperforming Nintendo 64.
What?
On the other hand, you had the new hotness, Sony's PlayStation, with the PlayStation 2 being the successor to the most successful console up to that point. There seemed very little reason for any other manufacturers to join the console market. In fact, Sega was leaving the hardware business for that reason. But Microsoft decided to take the plunge anyway, prepared to funnel money into this new venture. By the time the dust settled around 2004 or 2005, the original Xbox ended up doing well, but only slightly better than the GameCube, and lagged far behind the PlayStation 2. Which went on to become the highest selling console of all time. While the PlayStation 2 had tons of revolutionary exclusive titles, iconic peripherals, and a DVD player, the Xbox had Halo. Luckily, all the Xbox needed was Halo. At least, that's all they needed in their home country of the United States. But when Microsoft started planning their HD generation console, they knew they needed more than Halo if they wanted to dominate the global market. When evaluating the impact the original Xbox had on gaming around the world, it's hard not to notice how it failed in gaming's homeland, Japan. There are numerous infamous stories of how Microsoft blundered their Japanese launch, with a few bad decisions completely ruining their image in Japan. Everything about the original Xbox was geared towards an American market, i.e. it was really big.
It was huge and Japanese homes were small. That was sort of one of the first things that made the Japanese people wonder, does this company know what it's doing?
The console, the controller, the games. Everything was made with the American market in mind. Not to mention, Microsoft did not understand how to conduct business in Japan, and spent the entire run of the original Xbox making mistake after mistake. At one point, they had the opportunity to make Resident Evil 4 exclusive to the Xbox. But thanks to some uninformed translators, the deal fell through, with the father of Resident Evil, Shinji Mikami, walking out on them. Before Microsoft could even set up another meeting, Mikami had already signed the papers with Nintendo. In this way, they lost any goodwill they could have had with many developers and publishers. Many of them were loyal to Sony and to Nintendo, not willing to take a risk on Microsoft's new venture. Not to mention, Japanese consumers often felt the console wasn't made for them, so
Why bother?
while Microsoft did try to win some goodwill by bringing Japanese-centric games to the console, notably Dreamcast sequels like Shenmue 2 and Jet Set Radio Future, it was lacking in one thing that both the PS2 and GameCube dominated: Japanese role-playing games. While not exactly the case anymore, JRPGs were one of the most dominant genres in the late 90s and early 2000s. This time period brought tens of hundreds of fondly remembered and influential RPGs from the East. Final Fantasy VII made JRPGs popular in the West, with Squaresoft flooding the PS1 and PS2 with grand RPG adventures. Many series gained popularity or started here. Games like Persona, Tales, Wild Arms, Dragon Quest, Suikoden, Star Ocean, the list goes on. There are entire videos and even YouTube channels dedicated to the PS1 and PS2 library of JRPGs. But that exclusivity was a problem for Microsoft. Despite working with many prominent Japanese companies like Sega, Konami, and Tecmo, they just could not break into the Japanese market. In an effort to reach Japanese audiences and diversify their exclusives, Microsoft made a hard push trying to obtain Japanese RPGs for the Xbox 360. Unfortunately for them, this era of gaming would see the temporary fall of JRPGs across the world. Due to a wide host of factors, Japanese developers lost their hold on the gaming market throughout the world, thanks to higher budgets, difficulties moving into the HD era, and the rise of mobile gaming in Japan. These once lauded and cutting-edge developers reached a scary slump in releases. At the same time, Microsoft's efforts to release interesting and new Japanese role-playing games on the 360 quickly lost steam after the first few years. By the time 2010 rolled around, Microsoft had aimed their sights at something completely different, that being the Kinect and Call of Duty. The 360 overall was still a failure in Japan. As of 2016, it sold only 2.1 million in the entire country. While the PS3 and Wii were still big successes, Japanese developers struggled adapting to HD development, thanks in part to their loyalty to Sony and their difficult to develop for PlayStation 3. As Japanese developers struggled to release new titles and establish franchises or create unique titles, JRPGs fell out of favor in the West, while Western RPGs like Mass Effect and Elder Scrolls skyrocketed in popularity. Due to these elements and many more, there were only a handful of JRPGs developed exclusively for the Xbox 360. On the bright side, all of those RPGs are fascinating in their own right. Every single one of them has serious talent behind them, with creative premises or innovative ideas. They serve as fascinating snapshots of this era in gaming, not only showing what Japan was going through in terms of development, but also in Microsoft's willingness to experiment during the early days of the 360. I personally am enamored with these 360 exclusive JRPGs. My console of choice growing up was the Xbox 360, where I mainly played the popular shooters and action games of the day. I also discovered my love for creative indie titles through the Xbox Arcade. One genre I did stay away from were those JRPGs. The main thing that kept me away from these games, and most games at that time, were online reviews from the likes of IGN and game trailers. Whenever they gave something a negative or even just a mediocre review, I rarely ever bought the game. And during this period, 360 JRPGs were not treated kindly by these outlets. As I grew up, I discovered my love for the genre of role-playing games thanks to the 3DS and PlayStation 4. Specifically the Persona series and Bravely Default. At the same time, I realized there were classic series that I had missed out on for almost 20 years. I had never beaten a Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, never had the opportunity to play Kingdom Hearts or Shin Megami Tensei in general, and I never gave those odd RPGs on the Xbox 360 a chance. Once I started looking more into these games of the past that I missed out on, I started seeing the familiar covers of games I used to pass on the shelf in GameStop. These titles I once skipped now seemed endlessly fascinating. Akira Toriyama's art style for Blue Dragon looked great on the box. Eternal Sonata's premise and cell shading is gorgeous even to this day. I have plenty of nostalgic memories playing Tales of Vesperia, one of the first JRPGs I ever fully completed. And wait a second, does that say From Software? I soon realized that the only way to quench my thirst for weird JRPGs was to play them myself. That's because I also realized that, as far as I can tell, no one has made a series covering this era of games. I want to go through these JRPGs one by one, analyzing not only the games, but if possible, the context surrounding their release and development. The history of these games is interesting on their own, and they directly impact the choices these developers made while creating the games. While there's no guarantee that every game here will be great, I'm sure that they all at least are interesting and worth discussing. In this series, I will be looking at every JRPG released exclusively for the Xbox 360 and localized into English. I will not look at any games that were released on other consoles at the same time, so no Final Fantasy XIII, no Resonance of Fate, and no Nier. Many of these games were timed exclusives, like Eternal Sonata and Tales of Vesperia, which eventually got enhanced PS3 ports. But since they launched on the 360 first, I count these as console exclusives. As long as they were exclusive to the Xbox 360 for a time and were advertised as such, I'll cover them here. This is also a new project for me, requiring me to capture game footage and analyze a medium I've only briefly discussed on this channel. But my goal with creating YouTube videos is to discuss topics that interest me, and few things are as enamoring as Xbox 360 Japanese role-playing games. I hope you'll join me for this journey as we discover the nostalgic highs and the disappointing lows of one of gaming's most tumultuous times.